By the early 1960s, the oil and natural gas industries had supplanted farming and agriculture as the backbone of the economy of southwest Louisiana. Between 1960 and 1990, wages across the region rose and the standard of living nearly doubled as other businesses had to compete for skilled labor, with higher wage oil and refinery jobs and other associated sectors of the petroleum industry. Over the second half of the 20th century, southwest Louisiana would establish itself as an important center for business and commerce across the Ark-La-Tex and Gulf Coast region. The construction of Toledo Bend Reservoir and Dam began in early 1964, and work continued on the project for another 5 years, across the western section of northern Vernon Parish and the full length of Sabine Parish up into the southern tip of DeSoto Parish, as well as Sabine, Shelby, and Panola counties in Texas on the Sabine River. Once completed, the hydroelectric dam that was built would produce electricity for eastern Texas and northwestern Louisiana. Funded entirely by the states of Texas and Louisiana, the Toledo Bend Dam Reservoir remains as the only public water conservation and hydroelectric power project entirely funded without the participation of the federal government. At about 65 miles long and 10 miles wide, Toledo Bend Lake covers a total of 185,000 acres in size and has an average depth of about 24 feet. It is also one of the largest man-made lakes in America, the largest freshwater lake in the South. Since its completion, the Toledo Bend Reservoir has become a prime vacation spot for people around the region and across the nation. From the end of Reconstruction until more recent times, Louisiana's political landscape was dominated by the state Democratic Party machine, with very little serious opposition from the few scattered pockets of Republican resistance, mainly confined to a handful of urban districts along the lower Mississippi River between New Orleans and Baton Rouge, and several rural farming communities in the northern parishes of the state. With the rapid post-war industrialization that took place in the years following World War II, Louisiana would see the same population shift that took place in other areas of the country, as middle-class whites moved off the farms and out of urban areas to more suburban communities. This, along with the growing resentment against the civil rights movement and other liberal policies, would see Louisiana, like the rest of the South, begin to open up to a more competitive two-party system, as the state moved from being a solidly Democratic stronghold to becoming a highly competitive swing state over the second half of the 20th century. In 1956, President Dwight D. Eisenhower would become the first Republican to carry Louisiana, or any state in the Deep South, since the Reconstruction era, which opened the state up to becoming a hotly contested battleground state over the next few decades. At the state level, the shift in voting habits was slower to catch fire. It wasn't until 1980 that Dave Treen became the first Republican governor of Louisiana since the end of Reconstruction. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, the GOP would slowly displace the old Southern Democratic Party in Louisiana and across the rest of the South. By the year 2000, Louisiana had moved from a Democratic Party majority state to a solidly Republican one. And over the next 20 years, the voter demographics of the state had completely flipped from what it had been just a few decades before. Until by 2024, the state GOP held every important statewide office with the Democratic Party, now relegated to a few urban communities in the state's metropolitan centers, just as the Republican Party had been a century before. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve was established by the Ford administration in late 1974 in the wake of the OPEC oil embargo in response for America's support of Israel during the brief Yom Kippur War between Israel and several Arab nations. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve is housed mainly along the Gulf Coast of southeast Texas and southwest Louisiana and was intended to be an emergency reserve of raw crude oil in the event of a national emergency or economic crisis. The SPR holds around 714 million barrels worth of oil, enough to power the U.S. economy for up to 18 days at full capacity, and is scattered along the area of the Gulf Coast from outside of Wind, Texas, to Bayou Choshaw near Baton Rouge, with the large fields stored in salt domes at the Hackberry facility just outside of Lake Charles in central Calcasieu Parish. With the discovery of multiple untapped petroleum reserves in the U.S. in the last 2.5 decades, and the rise of alternate energy sources in recent years, some have started questioning the need for the SPR, but most folks agree it will be with us for a very long time to come. One of the most bizarre events in the history of the lower end of the western Louisiana frontier took place on February 15, 1984, when a helicopter that had been stolen in Galveston, Texas, piloted by a highly decorated Vietnam veteran named James Richard Little, touched down in the parking lot of the local branch of the Merchants and Farmers Bank in Leesville, Louisiana, and 4 armed men dressed in police officer uniforms scurried out and entered the bank, and what was one of the most perfectly executed armed robberies in modern American history. No one was harmed in the incident, and the men quickly made their getaway in the helicopter with around $160,000 in cash. As they went on an armed robbery spree that lasted several days between Louisiana and Oklahoma, authorities put out an all-points bulletin for the assailants in the chopper, which was later found in an abandoned field in Catoosa, Oklahoma, just outside of Tulsa. For several years, the men remained at large until the FBI got a tip after one of the men was overheard bragging about the daring heist in a nightclub in the San Antonio, Texas area. The men would serve extensive prison sentences for the much publicized crime, and the incident is remembered by the local folks around Leesville and the surrounding area as the legendary Leesville helicopter bank robbery of 1984. For the next 2.5 decades, Southwest Louisiana would continue to open up to the outside world as new industries and businesses settled in the area, as people from all over the country were drawn to this part of Louisiana, intrigued by its unique culture and unmatched scenery, along with its laid-back way of life. What problems the region had were no different than those affecting other rural communities nationwide. At around 2:40 a.m. on Saturday, September 24, 2005, less than a month after Hurricane Katrina had devastated the New Orleans area, Hurricane Rita slammed into the Cameron coast, not far from the Texas state line. Like Audrey 4.5 decades before, Rita would leave a lasting impact across the southern end of western Louisiana, causing over $18.5 billion worth of damage, and cause widespread destruction that would claim the lives of 120 people across 4 states, adding to the pain and misery of the state still reeling from the blow of Hurricane Katrina. In the months that followed, there was some degree of resentment across the region at how little news coverage the storm had received compared to Katrina, with quite a few pointing to it as another example of how little attention is given by the state and federal government and national news media to the area of the state west of the Mississippi River. The region would quickly bounce back from this storm and spend the following years rebuilding, which sparked a building boom across the western half of Louisiana and the Gulf Coast that would last well into the following decade. In 2020, southwest Louisiana would be slammed by the twin impacts of Hurricane Laura and Delta, which struck Cameron Parish less than 12 miles apart in the span of just over a month, around the small settlement of Creole, between August 27th and October 9th. These storms together would cause over $30 billion worth of damage and claim the lives of 47 people across southwest Louisiana and into the interior of the country. The summer of 2023 would see the driest period the region had known in modern times, and widespread wildfires would claim numerous homes and businesses around the region and across the state, and claim over 600,000 acres of forest lands across the state, with the vast majority of these wildfires taking place in the lower half of western Louisiana. The worst of these massive fires is considered to be the Tiger Island fire in western Beauregard Parish. Brave firefighters and first responders from here and across the nation put their lives on the line and fought these monster fires to near exhaustion for weeks on end. These massive fires and the unprecedented drought that had made them possible would leave the region charred and scorched, and has been seared into the collective memory of everyone across our region that we will remember for the rest of our lives. Here in our forgotten corner of America, first settled by the majestic Native American tribes who once roamed our region, the last of the great Gulf Coast and Caribbean pirates, the runaway slaves, the first breed of the American cowboys, and the outlaws that found refuge here. We are a country and a world all to ourselves, carved from these precious pines, these rugged hills and swamps, by the score of timber workers who settled this stretch of the lost paradise of the southern end of the piney woods. These rough and tumble parts of the Badlands of Louisiana have seen 1,000 storms, floods, droughts, wildfires, and bitter years of struggle. But the folks here have faced every bit of it with faith, courage, and the raw grit that makes this quiet but beautiful place the savage Eden that it is, and the most beautiful part of the Promised Land, this side of heaven. But we wouldn't have it any other way.